Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Tzadi. This is the daf for Shabbat. We'll get started. Before we start, just remind everyone that the Mako challenge is starting on Monday. It's a challenge to learn 4 days a week, finish Masechet Makot before Shavuot. It's a great opportunity to get women to learn Gemara on a regular basis, to share it with your friends and family, put it on your status, on your Instagram, spread it around. Get more excitement going about women learning Gemara and show people how amazing learning can be by just having a small opportunity of learning that might encourage them to continue learning on a regular basis. So it's also a really interesting Masechet. For those who learned it already, you might remember about punishment, about the refuge city for an accidental murderer, all sorts of interesting topics that really get you thinking about the legal system. Okay, we're going to get started now on our daf with the end of the last Mishnah. We're going to finish up the last section, which is Rabbi Yochanan. We're in the middle of Rabbi Yochanan. He said that an Asha Mitzorah that was slaughtered, shelo lishmo, not for the sake of the right korban, still needs to come with the libations that go along with it. Why? Because if you don't say that, you're basically bringing nothing. Like what happens with an Asha Mitzorah if that you bring shelo lishmo? So it gets, remember the first Mishnah in Zvachim, it gets sacrificed anyway, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. Now, when an Asha Mitzorah gets sacrificed, there's no other way to do an Asha Mitzorah sacrifice, even though it's not really working for this leper, but the only way to do it is with the libations, and therefore it comes with libations, to which Rabbanit Michelle Farber said, well then, and he listed a whole bunch of cases, like the sheep that comes with the Korban HaOmer, that it needs a double mincha. So if you were to do that, shelo lishmo, you'd have to bring a double mincha. And what about the korban tamid that comes with these two pieces of wood? And all these, he gave some examples, and he said, basically same thing there with the morning tamid and the afternoon tamid. If you're going to bring them, why didn't Rabbi Yochanan say about those as well? To which the Gemara answered, oh yeah, well, he really did in Achinami, and therefore Amar Abaye Chad Minayu Nakat. That's right. That Abaye said, oh yeah, he just gave one example, Rabbi Yochanan, but of course he meant anything that's like it, including the 3 examples that Rabbanit Michelle Farber brought. But Rav Abba, or perhaps people change it to Rava Amar Bishlam Hanach Olotnin. He comes up with a differentiation between the cases. Those are korbanot olah. And therefore, right, the tamid shel shachar and bein arbaim, the korban tamid, and the keves that comes with the korban haomer. Ilo chazu lo'olat chova, karve lo'olat nedava. If they can't come as a chova, they could come as a nedava. In other words, there is such a thing as an olat nedava, and therefore olat nedava doesn't need those specific unique halachot. And therefore, there's value to it just being brought as a regular olah. But here, if we don't do the Asham Mitzorah as it's supposed to be done with the libations, Asham Nedava Mi'ika, there is no such thing as an Asham Nedava. Okay, you can't say, well, it'll be like a different Asham, but which comes without it. But there is no such thing as bringing a korban as an Asham if you just decide, oh, I'm bringing a voluntary offering. You only bring an Asham when you're obligated. So therefore, there's a reason to distinguish between the Asha Mitzorah, which would have to come with its libations, and the other cases which don't come with their usual items, if they're brought shelo lishma. Tanya Kavatei to Rabbi Yochanan. Now we're just going back to the basic law of Rabbi Yochanan that he said about the Asha Mitzorah. Asha Mitzorah sheshachatosha was just a brighter to support his law, his statement. Asha Mitzorah sheshachatosha lo lishmo o shelo natami damo al gabei behono, he adds. Either it was slaughtered for the sake of a different korban, or they didn't put the blood on the finger and the ear and the toe of the mitzorah, of the leper. So either which one of those things was done improperly. It does go on the altar, and ta'un nisachim, as Rabbi Yochanan said, and it comes with libations. But you don't fulfill your obligation. Again, that's back to the first Mishnah in Zvachim, which is you bring it anyway, but you're not going to fulfill your obligation. Okay, and therefore, this supports Rabbi Yochanan, that one particular phrase, ta'un nisachim, that it needs libations. Okay, new Mishnah. All the measuring implements in the temple were overflowed. Okay, we're going to talk about this soon, what this means, because we learned that they weren't all. But chutz mishal kohen gadol shahiyah godsha letocha. Other than the kohen gadol, that the godish was calculated within the kli itself, meaning it was measured machuk flat, if you remember. Okay, it was measured in a flat way, and the extra, okay, remember, this is a little strange for us, but we have 1 cup measuring cups. Their 1 cup measuring cups were actually a little less than a cup and included that if you added the overflow, it would reach 1 cup. Whereas for the Kohen Gadol, though, for his chavitim, they had to be divided in two. And because it had to be divided in two, we didn't want an overflow when you put it in the first vessel of the isaron and then divided in the other two. It had to be machuk flat. Otherwise, everything in the overflow, as we turned to pour it, would spill all over the place and we'd lose it. So therefore, so that's what the Mishnah says. Okay? Now, midot halach, we're now going to have a 3-way machloket, and now I'm going to start sharing the study guide for today. There's a study guide, which is very helpful to organize today's stuff. So we're now going to look actually at the second chart on the page. We're going to come back to the first chart because I did in the order of the way the Gemara dealt with it. So we're going to see now, right now we're focusing just on the words that are in red here, which is the source, the Tannaitic source, which is our Mishnah. Later, the Gemara is going to give an explanation, and that's what comes in the black font. Okay? Now, midat halach berutzehen kodesh, umidot hayavesh berutzehen chol. We actually referenced this Mishnah earlier in our Masechet, not so long ago. I don't remember exactly what daf, but we did talk about this. The midot halach, the liquid measurements, their berutzehen is kodesh. Anything that was either on the, okay, there's difference of opinion whether we mean on the rim of the vessel or what fell out of the vessel and touched the sides, the outsides of the vessel, is kodesh. Those are the liquid measuring cups. But midot hayavesh berutzehen chol. But the dry measuring cups, anything that overflowed, basically, that was on the rim or fell over the sides or touched the outside, is actually not sanctified. Now, everyone's going to actually agree with this, but they're going to come at it in different ways. Okay? Now, Rabbi Akiva Omer, midot halach kodesh, lefichach berutzehen kodesh. He says, why is the rim or what falls on the outside of the kli kodesh? Because in general, the midot halach, all the liquid measuring cups, are sanctified, and therefore anything that overflows is also sanctified. But midot hayavesh chol, but he disagrees completely. He thinks the midot hayavesh were not sanctified at all. This we actually saw. He thinks they weren't sanctified at all. And because they weren't sanctified here, I see now it's on Nun Zayin Amud Bet that we saw this. Lefichach berutzehen chol, because the kli itself is chol, well, therefore, obviously, then the overflow is going to be unsanctified as well. Rabbi Yossi Omer, he has a third way to distinguish, where he agrees with everybody that the berutzehen of the liquid are kodesh, and the ones of the chol are not, of the ones of the dry ones are not. But he has a completely different explanation. Lo mishum zeh, ela shehalach ne'ekal, vayavesh eno ne'ekal. He says the lach, now what happens when you pour liquid into a cup and then you overflow it? What part of what you poured in overflowed? Something that probably was in the vessel in the first place and then just overflowed, right? That's what it means, the lach ne'ekar. It comes out of its place and then overflows. The yavesh eno ne'ekar. If you're pouring flour into a measuring cup and then you overflow it, the overflow part was never in the cup before. It doesn't get mixed in with what was in between, what was in the kli. So what basically goes out of the liquid vessel was already in it first and became sanctified while it was in it. The dry was never in it, and therefore it never gets sanctified. So he agrees with Tanakama in theory that both of them are sanctified, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, who thinks the dry ones were not sanctified at all. But he says the reason why the Beirutz is Kodesh, now we don't know really the reason yet of Tanakama, we're going to see it soon, but the reason why the Beirutz is Kodesh of the Lach, he explains, is because it was originally in the vessel, in the walls of the vessel, and only came out after. Okay, as opposed to the dry, which wasn't. We're going to start now with the first question of the Gemara. Mani. According to who is the Mishnah? Okay, we're now talking about the first line. Kol midot were nigdashot, were overflowed. So now, Rabbi Meir chad gadush hava. It says all the vessels were overflowed. But what do you mean? We learned, according to Rabbi Meir, not so long ago, that there were two klis called an isaron. One was overflowed and one was flat. And there was a chatzi isaron that was machuk. So what do you see here? All the vessels were not nigdashot. Only one of them was the isaron, the one isaron that was gadush. Rabbanan chada umachuk hava. According to the rabbis, there was only one. In other words, there was only one kind. There was an isaron, there was a chatzi isaron. There weren't two isaronim. And both of them were machuk. Okay, that we learned in the sugya when we talked about this before, because we said they asked about Rabbi Meir, what was the chatzi saron? Was it machuk or gadush? And then they said, why didn't you ask about the rabbis? And they said, well, once we have Rabbi Meir, we'll be able to know what the rabbis say. Whatever he says for machuk, for the chatzi saron, that's what the chachamim were going to say for the isaron, the chatzi saron. And therefore, we got to the conclusion that he thinks they were machuk, they were flat. So, how could you say all the midot of the mikdash were overflow when it was only one, according to Rabbi Meir, and according to Chachamim, it was none? So Amar Rav Chisda lo alam Rabbi Meir, okay, it is obviously Rabbi Meir, umay kol midot, kol mididot. All measurements were done in a way that they overflowed when they measured them, other than when they measure for the Kohen Gadol. So it's not talking about all the measuring implements, it's talking about all the measurements that were done. And then it fits perfectly with Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara is going to basically look at this three-way machloket we saw, midot halach b'rutzehen kodesh, etc. B'mai kamiflige. So what's the root of the machloket between Tanna Kama, Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Yossi? We're going to see there's certain points they each, right, one agrees with the other on certain points but disagrees about other points. Tanna Kama. So first let's understand Tanna Kama, and here's where I said in the second chart on the page, it's the font that's, the regular black font. This is the words of the Gemara explaining the machloket. Tanna Kama savar, midot halach nimshecha, bein mibifnim, bein mimachutz. Midat yavesh nimshecha mibifnim, v'lo nimshecha mibachutz. Okay, so Tanna Kama didn't really explain on what basis they say that the liquid, the overflow is kodesh, and then the rim, and the dry not. So the Gemara says very simple. The vessels were anointed, remember that, sanctified the vessel, on the inside and the outside for the real liquid ones. But the dry ones were only anointed on the inside and not on the outside. So if it's anointed on the outside of the vessel, then it will sanctify whatever goes on the outside of the vessel. If it's anointed on the inside only, then it's only going to sanctify what's inside and not outside. And that's the way he explains it. Rabbi Akiva savar, midat halach nimshecha bein mibifnim bein mibachutz. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva agrees with Tanna Kama about the lach. He says, yeah, it was also the reason why their beirutz are kodesh is because it was anointed both inside and outside. But midai yavesh lo nimshecha kol ikal. But he said, and here's the big disagreement, this we learned already, he thinks the dry measuring utensils were not anointed at all, and therefore they're not sanctified. Rabbi Yossi savar, idi v'idi nimshecha mibifnim v'lo nimshecha mibachutz. Rabbi Yossi disagrees with both of them about all the vessels, and says basically, none of them were nimshach on the outside, okay? He agrees theoretically with Tanna Kama about the dry ones, that they were only inside and not outside. He disagrees with Rabbi Akiva completely, both because Rabbi Akiva thinks the dry ones weren't anointed at all, Rabbi Yossi thinks they were, and Rabbi Akiva said that the liquid ones, just like Tanna Kama had said, was inside and outside, and Rabbi Yossi says, no, they weren't done outside. No vessels are sanctified or anointed on the outside. So what's the reason? And this Rabbi Yossi already explained to us. Because the lach comes out, right? And it comes from inside the vessel. So it came, right? What happens? The liquid goes in, and then when you put too much in it, some of the liquid comes out, but it was already inside the walls of the vessel, and therefore became sanctified. And the yavesh eno ne'ekar, and that doesn't happen to the dry. Okay? And that basically explains the machloket. Now, Gemara is going to ask a difficulty on Rabbi Yossi and answer with two answers. And then the second answer with Ravina is going to be, we're going to bring a contradiction to Ravina from some other situation, from another Mishnah that's in another tendapim. Okay, that's going to be our structure for right now. So the difficulty on Rabbi Yossi is this. V'china ekar mai haves. So what if it was in the vessel and then came out of the vessel? Gavra l'maydit sarech kamachavin. Now you might recall, not so long ago, we had this machloket about whether klei sharet sanctify with or without the intent of the owner. So if we assume right now that klei sharet only sanctify with the intent of the owner, so if I need a log of oil for my mincha offering, and we pour a log of oil in, but we put too much, and some overflows and spills out. Now, in the end, okay, and I'm going to read it again from the words, Gaver l'maydit sarech kamachavin. When the person was pouring in the oil into the measuring cup, all they wanted was a log. They didn't want what fell out of it. Right? In the end, they just want the log that's left in it and not anything that overflows. So who cares whether it was in the walls of the kli? At some point, in the end, what do we sanctify? We sanctify what the owner wanted sanctified, which was exactly the log that's in there right now. So anything that went into the vessel and fell out of the vessel was never sanctified, because if you assume, that's going to be the big question, if you assume that a klei sharet is only mekadesh mida'at, with the intent of the owner, then the owner never intended for whatever is eventually going to fall out of that vessel, spill out, never intended for that to be sanctified, only the load that ends up at the end inside the vessel. So that's the difficulty. To which the obvious answer, Rav Dimi Bar Sisna Mishmei de Rav, he said the name of Rav, Zot Omeret Klei Sharet Mekachin Shalom Midat. What do you see here? Obviously, right, the fact that Rabbi Yossi says this is he must hold that the vessel is sanctified even without the intent of the owner, and therefore it went into the vessel. Who cares that it spilled out and the owner didn't need it and didn't intend for it? It doesn't matter. Sanctified vessels sanctify even without the intent of the owner, which we saw there was a machloket about this. Or Ravina Amar Lo Olame Malacha Klei Sharet Mekachin Ela Midat. Now let's go back and say, like we thought originally, they're only going to sanctify with the intent of the owner. Okay, which means theoretically this really should be sanctified. So why did Rabbi Yossi say it's sanctified? Ugzera Shema Yumru Motziim Klei Sharet Lechol. It's because of Gzera that maybe you'll say that they remove from Klei Sharet to Chol, that you could take something that was in a Klei Sharet and use it for any purpose you want. In other words, what's going to happen? This is just a gzera. If the liquid was in the vessel at some point and then spilled out, and the owner doesn't need it because the owner has the load that they need, so really whatever spilled out wasn't sanctified. But if people see, oh, that was originally in the vessel and it fell out, they're going to think that something that was in a vessel, that was actually supposed to be in the vessel, and was the intent of the owner to be in the vessel, that really it's not sanctified. Just because it went in the vessel, it's not sanctified. And then they'll basically say, oh, I can now use, some oil that someone poured in for a mincha offering. I can now use it for whatever purpose I want, because it's obviously not sanctified. And that's not true. So because it will lead people to come to some misunderstanding and then use kodesh for whole purposes, right? Use something sanctified for non-sanctified purposes. We basically are going to be strict about this. Okay? And any overflow is going to be sanctified just because of Gzera. That's Ravina's interpretation. So we have two possible interpretations of Rabbi Yossi. Either he just thinks that sanctifies even without the intent of the owner, or it's just a Gzera. And the second one, as I said before, Rabbi Zera is going to come with a contradiction. Motive Rabbi Zera. And for this, again, there's a chart on the page showing the contradiction and the resolution. So, okay. Ravina basically said it's a gzera, according to this, that maybe people think that you could take something from a klei sharet and use it for any purpose you want. So motive Rabbi Zera, sideret halechem, the Mishnah in Daf Kuf says, sideret halechem be'etzeh bezichim la'achar Shabbat. If you remember, the lechem apanim are supposed to be set up on Shabbat. And then you're supposed to remove them the following Shabbat. Now, if you don't remove them and then you're supposed to burn the frankincense, and then you can eat the bread. If you don't remove them on Shabbat and you leave them through Saturday night, it's what you call psul lina, right? Usually psul lina kicks in the end of that day. But in this case, you have the whole week, and it only kicks in at the end of the week on Motzei Shabbat. Now, it says here, what if you set up the lechem and the bezichim and the frankincense after Shabbat? Meaning, you didn't do it the right day. You did it on Sunday, you did it on Monday, on Tuesday, it doesn't matter, sometime after Shabbat. And then came the next Shabbat, and what did you do? You're supposed to do every Shabbat. Hikfir to bezichim b'Shabbat. And then you burnt the bezichim, right, the bezichim levona, on the following Shabbat, psula. You've disqualified those breads because they weren't on the table for the entire week. Okay, so what if I set them up on Sunday? What do I do? Ketzad yaseh? Yenicheru l'Shabbat haba'ah. I leave it for almost 2 weeks, basically. I leave it through the next Shabbat, and I leave it till after that Shabbat, until the following Shabbat. Now, normally, what do we say after Shabbat? Psulina, okay? Usually we'd assume Motzei Shabbat kicks in, it already is disqualified. But here, we don't say that. They say, even if it's on the shulchan for many days, basically because it has to go through Shabbat to Shabbat. So as long as it was put on after Shabbat, we can leave it for an extra week till the following Shabbat. Now, why would this be okay? Based on Ravina's Gzera, why wouldn't you say Hatam Nami Lema? Why wouldn't you say also here, isn't there a reason to make a Gzera? Gzera Shema Yamru Mafkidim B'Klei Sharet. People will say that you can leave things, right, in a klei sharet past the designated time. Now, here we see we can leave it on the table way beyond its time now, and then you'll think, let's say I put it on Shabbat and I left it the next Shabbat, I didn't take it off, and I left it there. Maybe I'll think, oh, it's not disqualified because look, if it wasn't disqualified this Shabbat for leaving it through Saturday night, then maybe any Shabbat I could leave it through Saturday night. So wouldn't it be the same type of gzeira that people will see and look, they'll miscomprehend. And they'll come to leave the lechem apanim another week and use it, and it's really disqualified. So there's an obvious answer to this. Pnim achutz karamit. You're bringing a contradiction, Rabbi Sarah, from something that goes on inside in the sanctuary to something that goes on outside in the courtyard. Of course, there's no comparison. Pnim lav kol hayade. What goes on inside the Eichel, most people don't see. What's the concern? We're concerned about all sorts of people seeing, and they don't really know the halacha, and they'll miscomprehend. But who sees what goes on in the Eichel? It's a closed room. Only the kohanim go in, and only a few at a time. And there's no concern of any misunderstanding. But bechutz, if you're in the courtyard, there were lots of people that went in and out of the courtyard, and people could see into the courtyard. Kulei amayade. Anyone could know. And therefore, the things that go on in sanctified vessels, we're worried that people, right, the overflow, we're worried that people will see and miscomprehend and come to the wrong conclusion, and therefore we're going to be concerned in that case and yet not concerned in the case of the lechem hapanim. Okay, Tznan hatam. Now we're going to quote a Mishnah about the motar nisachim, okay, about the remainder of the libations. Okay, because right, we're talking about libations here, and now the remainder of the libations, we're going to say leketz hamizbeach. In Masechet Shkalim, we talked about this a lot. The ketz hamizbeach. What is ketz hamizbeach? Ketz hamizbeach is that they wanted the mizbeach to be working as much as possible, so they took all these extra things that were already sanctified, and they said you can use them if they're animals. You can use them on the altar for korbanot olah. If they're things that have value, or if it's money, just go buy animals with them. If it's objects, then redeem them for money and take the money and use it for buying animals to go on the altar, to just have animals going on the altar, voluntary olah, burnt offerings. So it says in the Mishnah there, extras that are left over from the libations go, again, the value of it goes to the ketz hamizbeach, to these korbanot olah. My motar nisachim. What does it mean? Extra libations. So for this, we're going to have two answers. You can look on the chart. Okay, Rabbi Chia Amar, and then we're going to have a braita to support each one. Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef Amar berutzei midot. It's overflow. Okay, now what overflow are they talking about here? It's a good question. Some people say that when they measured, let's say the sellers who sold to the temple, and the temple went and spent the temple money to buy solet, and then they bought extra, and then they didn't need all of it. Okay, so whatever they didn't need, that already was bought with sanctified money, so that goes to the ketz hamizbeach. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Kotasha Shaninu, like it says in a different place. Okay, it's also, I think this is also a Mishnah in Shkalim. Let me just check. Yeah, it's a Mishnah in Shkalim. HaMekabel alav l'sapek slatot me'arba v'amdu b'shalosh yisapek me'arba. Okay, the first case isn't relevant, but it builds to the next. Which is, if the temple went to, or somebody said, I'm going to buy for my korban mincha, I'm going to buy solet. Okay, now I'm going to buy it at the price that it is right now. I'm going to buy it at 4, that's arba, 4 for, let's say, a shekel. So it's the price of 4 for a shekel. And we made an arrangement. I made with someone to buy. I'm going to buy solet at 4 se'ah for a shekel. And I'm due b'shalosh. But then the price went up, and it was 3 se'ah for a shekel. Actually, we're talking about now, mekabel alav, right? Yeah. So this is, Rashi, the Ketav Yad, says it's Adam shekibel ma'ot min hagizbal. He got money from the treasury. Okay, we're taking the temple money we're talking about, because we're going to see if the treasury is what we're talking about here, not a person, like a personal. It's the treasury is buying. So a person goes with the treasury's money and he goes to buy for the temple, and he makes an arrangement with the seller. I'm going to buy you at the going rate, 4 se'ah for a shekel. And then the price changed, and it's now you only get 3 se'ah for the shekel. Well, yisapek me'arba. Too bad, but the seller has to give me for the original price because we made that arrangement. But moving now to Amavet, but mishalosh v'amdu me'arba. What if we made an arrangement that I was going to buy them for 3 for a shekel, and then the price went down, and I can now get 4 for a shekel? Misapek me'arba. Even though I made an arrangement with you that I was going to do get it for 3, I'm now to get it 3 for a shekel. I'm now going to get 4 se'ah for a shekel. I'm going to get extra. Sheyad hekdesh ala elyona, because the hekdesh, that's why it's important to explain the case was the hekdesh, the treasury buying it. The treasury always wins. So if the prices went up, the treasury gets the low price. And if the prices went down, the treasury gets the new lower price. Now, if I basically took money from the treasury to buy 3 se'ah for a shekel, and now I'm getting 4 se'ah, the 4 is extra, right? All I needed was 3, but now I'm getting 4 for my money. So the 4th is the extra botar money, and that's what's going to go to Ketz HaMizbeach. Tanya Kavatei to Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef, and Tanya Kavatei to Rabbi Yochanan. So now we have these 2 explanations. Is it the Beirut Semidot, the extra, the overflow, or is it the lower price, right, if the price is dropped? So Tanya Kavatei to Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef, Beirut Semidot halalu, ma yosim behem. What would you do with the extra overflow? Okay, the first obvious, easiest thing to do is go find another animal, korban, and use it for that one. V'im lanu, but if it was left overnight, now they're going to get disqualified overnight. In other words, let's say you don't have another korban that day, you have nothing to do with that extra. V'im lav, so if it's not disqualified, Belina, and you don't have another sacrifice to connected to mikitzim behem et hamizbeach. So you redeem it basically, and then use the money to buy korbanot olah. V'keitzemahu, what do you do? The Braita just continues and tells us, even though we already talked about this, but the Gemara hadn't yet. Olot, they're olot. V'habasar l'Shem v'orot l'kohanim, and the meat goes to God, it all gets burnt, and the hide goes to the kohanim, like every korban olah. Tanya Kavatei Rabbi Yochanan, here's the bright supporting Rabbi Yochanan, Mekabel alav l'sapek slato me'arba, v'amdu mishalosh, mesapek me'arba, mishalosh v'amdu me'arba, mesapek me'arba. Okay, that was exactly like the Mishnah. If the price changed, basically, it's always going to benefit the hekdesh, sheyad hekdesh ala elyona, but here comes the line that proves that this has to do with the motar nisachim, v'zeu shashaninu motar nisachim l'ketz hamizbeach, and that's what it says in the Mishnah, the motar nisachim goes to the ketz hamizbeach. Okay. Now, right, that this extra that they gained from the price fluctuation is going to go to the Ketz HaMizbeach. Okay, so this is very simple. You can look again at the chart and just see it charted out on the study guide. We had 2 different explanations for what are Beirut Semidot. What are Motar Nesachim, either Beirut Semidot or price fluctuation. And we got a Braita to support each one. Okay, now we're going to move to a new Mishnah. And the Mishnah talks about which korbanot need libations and which don't, right? A pretty obvious, important issue for us to know, right? We've talked a lot about the nisachim, but what korbanot do they go with? Kol korbanot tzibur v'yachid tu'unim nisachim. Okay, it sounds like everything, although we're going to see in a minute, but not this. So all public, right, communal and individual offerings need libations. Chutz mean other than, here are the only exceptions to the rule. Habechor, the firstborn animal, which gets slaughtered. The maser, the tithe, the animal tithe that has to also be, offered in the temple. Ha-Pesach, korban Pesach, doesn't need libations. Ha-Chatat v'ha-Asham, and any chatat or asham. Okay, other than Ela, there's one exception to the exceptions to the rule, or 2 exceptions. Shechatato shel mitzorah v'ashamo tu'unim nisachim, as we saw before. Both, okay, we talked about the asham, also the chatat. Okay, the chatan and the asham of the mitzorah, of the leper, need libations. So no other chatat or asham needs libations, and the Pesach, b'chor ma'asir don't. Everything else needs libations, and the chatat and the asham of the leper. So now where are we going to get all this from? We're now going to start darshaning this from a pasuk. Okay, so I'm going to bring up again the study guide, which has the pasuk. It's a pasuk in Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 3, which is talking about the libations. And it reads like this. We're going to darshan all the different sections of this pasuk. Asitem ishel Hashem. You're going to make a fire to God. Ola o zevach. Okay, a korban ola, or a zevach, or a slaughter, right? Zevach is usually an animal slaughtered. Lefalei neder onit b'nedava. If you expressed a neder, a vow, or, right, the 2 different kinds of vows, neder and nedava, o b'moadechem, or on your holidays. L'asor reach nichach la'Hashem, to make a pleasing smell to God. Mina bakar o menatzon, whether it's from the cattle or from the sheep family. So now the Gemara is going to bring a Braita. Tanu Rabbanan is going to darshan this pasuk. V'asitem ishel Hashem. Yachol kol ha'oleishim yetu nisachim afilu mincha. Sounds like maybe anything that gets burned from the words ishel Hashem would need libations. Maybe even a mincha. Now, what libations? Isn't a mincha libation? So what do you mean? You bring a mincha with a mincha? Well, remember, the libations were both minchas, and they were wine. So maybe you would have to bring a wine libation if you brought a mincha. Talmud lama ola. Therefore, it says ola to say no. Only korban ola and things like a korban ola, not a mincha. An ola is an animal sacrifice. A mincha is a meal offering, not the same category. So from the word olah, we get that a mincha doesn't need libations. Shlamim minayin. How do we know, though, that a shlamim does? Because it just says olah. How do you know also a shlamim, peace offerings, need libations? Talmud lamar zevach. The word zevach includes other animals, other offerings, animal offerings, like a shlamim. Choda minayin. How do you know also a korban toda? O zevach. Talmud lamar o zevach. Because it says or zevach, the word or comes to include also a korban toda. Yachol shani marbet. Okay, so once we include zevach, maybe zevach includes, right? And o zevach, maybe it would include all animal sacrifices. So maybe ani marbet, I would include af bechor u'maaser or pesach v'chatav asham, which we know are not included, right? So maybe I would include those. Talmud lamar lefalei neder o b'nedava. Because the pasuk then says to express as a neder or a nedava, what do we learn from this? Ba b'neder or nedavato nisachim. Anything that can come as a neder and nedava, meaning even if it's not, but since it could potentially, since an ola could be voluntary or not, right, or obligatory, and a shlamim can be voluntary or not voluntary, right? So those need nisachim. But she'eino ba b'neder or nedava. Now the 5 on our list of exceptions, the Pesach is a chovah, bachor maaser are obligations, Chatat and Asham are obligations. So, Eino ba b'neder u'nedava, Eino u'nisachim. So, from the words, the falei neder u'nedava, we learned it has to be something that potentially could come as a neder u'nedava. Okay, so mashma lo tziat elu. So then, okay, so I get that those 5 are out. But then I would think, let's include even more. Other things that come only as obligations. Otzi et chavot habaot machmat haregel beregel. All the offerings brought on the holidays would have to be also their obligations, and they don't come as neder and nedava. You can't just voluntarily say, I'm going to bring the korbanot that we bring on the holidays. Umayninu, what are those? Olot re'iyah v'shamei chagiga. Okay, there's special olot you bring when you come to the temple. They're called olot re'iyah, because re'iyah pnei Hashem, seeing the face of God on the holidays, and shamei chagiga, the shlamim that you bring that are chagiga offerings. So maybe those don't need libations. Talmud lomar, o b'moadechem. So that's the next words in the pasuk, or on your holidays. O b'moadechem comes to include even things, kol haba b'moadechem te'un nisachim. All the ones that come in the holidays need libations. Okay, and therefore we include all the holiday ones, except for one. What's the one we exclude? Well, mashma laviet elu. Okay, so I get then you're going to bring all the holiday ones. Well, there's one on the holiday though that doesn't come with libations. What's that? Abisi rezi. Well, then I would think to include the goat sin offering that's brought on all the holidays, because it's also a holiday offering, and Moadechem includes holiday offerings. Talmud lamar b'chita aseh ben bakar bichlal haya v'lama yatsa la'kish elav. Okay, so why does it say v'chita aseh ben bakar? Okay, this is a few psukim later, after it already says mina bakar u'binatzon. This is in Pasuk Gimel in the chapter. In Pasuk Chet, 5 psukim later, it says, now there it seems to talk again about bringing, right, a ben bakar. Now we already said a ben bakar as a neder and a dava. So why is it? So ben bakar bichlale. I was already included in the beginning. The lama yatsa. So why was it given as an exception, like it was separated out from the group by having its own pasuk? To teach you, ma ben bakar miyucha ba b'neder nedava, just like a ben bakar can come as neder nedava, and that you get from which we're going to go to that pasuk soon. The first pasuk in Vayikra, okay, pasuk bet, which is anyone who brings a korban Hashem mina beima, mina bakar, mina tzon, right? You can bring from bakar or mina tzon. They're voluntary offerings. Av kol ba b'neder nedava. So again, another exception to say not something that comes that is not neder nedava. And what does it come to exclude? This series in Menachot Chatan. Now this is a little bit strange because we already excluded, and as we did like this, as we said, Mefalei neder nedava teaches you only things that come neder nedava. But then Moadechem included things that don't. But not all things that don't, because the Shiur Chatat is an exception to the rule. And that we get from this extra words, V'chita se ben bakar, comes later. Why does it say ben bakar? To exclude something additional that it has to come b'neder or nedava. Okay, and that excludes the Sirizim. Now, why would the Sirizim be out and the Olat Riyan Shel Bechaga would be in? Those need Nisachim and that one doesn't. Again, it seems pretty obvious, even though it doesn't say so, right? You would expect the Gemara to say Mara'ita. Why is that? And in the end, we have exclusion, inclusion, right? One is included, one is excluded. But it makes sense that it would be the chatat in the end that's excluded because it's a sin offering, and sin offerings never come b'neder and nidava, whereas the Olat Riyan Shel Bechagiga are tight. These particular ones are only obligatory, but they come, they're broader umbrella, they're part of Olot and Shlamim, which could come b'neder and nidava, as opposed to chatat, which never comes b'neder or nidava. Okay, last part of this drasha now. Okay, so now we have la'asot reach nichach la'Hashem mina bakar o minatzon. So the end of that pasuk now, because we just did b'moadechem. Now we're up to la'asot reach nichach la'Hashem from the bakar or minatzon. Ma Talmud lamar. Okay, what's that part of the pasuk telling you? Lefi shenemar ola shomeani afilu olat ha'of b'mashma. Because it says ola, well, there's olat ha'of also. So maybe bird offerings need libations. Talmud lamar mina bakar minatzon, and that's why it says specifically mina bakar minatzon to exclude animals. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia. So Rabbi Yoshia says this end of the pasuk is coming to say only animals, not birds. Rabbi Yonatan Omer no tzarich. He says, what do you mean? You don't need that. Obviously, it's only birds from earlier in the pasuk. Why? Harehu omer zevach ve'ofi no zevach. We know that the word zevach refers to slaughtering of animals, not birds. So you don't need to learn it from the end of this pasuk. So what does the end of the pasuk for him come to do? Well, lefi shene'amar, because it says, im kem matamud lomar mina bakar minatzon. So according to Rabbi Yonatan, then what are you doing with mina bakar minatzon here? Seems completely unnecessary. To which he explains, lefi shene'amar, because it says in the beginning of Vayikra, the pasuk I quoted before, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban la'Hashem mina be'ema, from animals. And then it says, mina bakar umin hatzon, from animals, right? From the cattle and from the sheep. Now, notice our pasuk says, mina bakar o min hatzon, or from the sheep. So that's what our pasuk does differently, and it's going to teach us about the original pasuk. Okay? Yachol ha'omer harei alai ola yavi mishnehem. If you just looked at the first pasuk in Vayikra, you would have said, maybe it has to bring, if I say I'm going to bring an ola, mina be'ema, from the animal, right? Mina bakar min hatzon. Maybe I have to bring one from bakar and one from tzon. So, right, Yachol omer, I'm going to read it again. Harei alai ola yavi mishnehem. Maybe I have to bring from both. Talmud lomar, that's why our pasuk says, mina bakar min hatzon. Ratzah achad mivi, ratzah shnayim mivi. Our pasuk comes to teach us that the phrase mina bakar uminatzon also means the same as mina bakar ominatzon, and that when this pasuk reflects back on Vayikra and teaches us about Vayikra, chapter 1, verse 2, that it really means either or. Okay, that sounds very logical, sort of. I mean, it's not exactly the most logical, because why is our pasuk here teaching us about that pasuk there? You could also theoretically say, well, here it says oh, there it says vi. Obviously, they're two different things, but no, that's not what he says. But the problem with Rabbi Yonatan is going to come from somewhere else, which is a famous machlok of Rabbi Yonatan and Rabbi Yoshia, which we've learned before. Ish asher kalel et aviv ve'et imo, a person who curses his father and his mother. Now, the pasuk says father and his mother. So how do we know that if he curses only his father or his mother, he's going to get punished as well? And the answer that Rabbi Yonatan gives is because every time it says this and that, it always means this or that, unless it says yachdav, together. And it doesn't say both of them. So when it doesn't say both of them, it actually means either or. So that's why the Gemara is going to ask about him. Rabbi Yonatan, why do I need a pasuk to teach me that? Ha'amar, didn't he say ad she'ifrot l'cha katuv yachdav? Unless the pasuk says yachdav, it obviously means either or. So you don't need our pasuk to teach you how to read Vayikra Perek Aleph pasuk bet, when it's very obvious from something Rabbi Yonatan says elsewhere that it's either or. To which they're going to say, Yitzrich. You need that, and you'll have to wait till tomorrow to see why. Sakdat chamina, you might have thought, I'll leave us hanging. Okay, that's the end of our daf. You might have thought something, and that's why Rabbi Yonatan needed to say it here. Okay, you might have thought there's some exception here. Okay, so with that, we finished our daf. Let's just do a quick review. So we had Rabbi Yochanan who said about this Asher Mitzvah that was Shalol Lishma needs libations, because otherwise what's it going to be? And then we said, what about, why didn't he mention other things? Either he really meant, that's according to Abai, or according to Rava, it's only here because this can't come neder and nedava. Okay, by the way, we're ending the way we started about the neder and nedava and the differentiation between things that could become voluntary offerings and things that can't be voluntary offerings ever. Okay, and that's why the Asham Mitzvah stands out different from the other examples. And then I'm just going to use the study guide to help us review the daf because the rest is really in the study guide, which is then we had the Kol HaMidot Shebemikdash were Nikdashot, except for one, and then we had to say in the end, the Mishnah Mashmash Rabbi Meir, and it doesn't really mean Midot because they weren't, all the measuring implements weren't overflowed, but all the Mididot, all the measurements were overflowed other than the Kohen Gadol one. Then we have this three-way machloket between Tanakam, Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Yossi, who really all think that the beirutz of the dry measurements is not sanctified and the liquid ones is sanctified, but they all came at it from a completely different way. Whether they were sanctified inside and outside is the machloket, or whether the dry ones were never sanctified at all, or whether nothing on the outside is sanctified, but because it was inside first and then came out, and that would only be true for liquid and not for dry. Then that was Rabbi Yossi, and then we had a difficulty on that because aren't we only sanctifying whatever the person wants sanctified, and that would be whatever remains in there and not what fell out? So we had two answers to that question. When we got to the second one, we really said it's just a gzera, and then that seemed to contradict. Well, why don't we make the same gzera by the lechem hapanim, or the same type of gzera? And that's because the lechem hapanim is something that goes on inside the sanctuary where almost nobody sees, and there's no reason for gzera there. From there, we moved on to the machloket about motar nesachim, l'ketz mizbeach. What are the motar nesachim? And that related to us because it was the beirut midot, which is what we were talking about. According to one opinion, according to the other opinion, it had nothing to do with our topic. It was just about the prices dropping, and then the hekdesh ends up with more. That goes to the ketz mizbeach. And then we ended with which sacrifices need libations, which don't, and it was mostly darshan from this one pasuk in Bamidbar chapter 15, verse 3, except for one other thing, which was from pasuk chet there. But basically, we have all these different things to say which are included and which are excluded. Basically, animals, not birds, not minchas, but only animal ones that aren't can potentially come as neder or nidava. And then within the holiday ones, which are actually obligatory, even though since they're types that come by neder or nidava, as opposed to the Shiur chatat, which does not come with libations, even though it's a holiday offering, because it's also never a sin offering, never comes as a voluntary offering. And then we ended with this machloket about how to understand this mina bakar or minatzon. Is it coming to exclude the birds? According to Rabbi Yonasan, it isn't. It's coming to teach us about something way back in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, to which the Gemara said, according to your theory, it shouldn't really be doing that, and we'll get back to that in the next stuff. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and we will meet up again on Sunday.